the hermit of Hemlock Creek. The wind, a malevolent sculptor, had carved drifts into sinuous dunes around Elias Thorne's dugout. From a distance, it appeared less like a dwelling and more like a monstrous, hay-covered molehill, a bizarre eruption from the snow-choked earth. Jeb Miller, hunched over the handlebars of his snow machine, slowed his pace as he skirted the edge of Thorne's claim. He'd been heading to check his furthest trapline, a journey usually made with a clear head, but the sight of Elias's place always snagged at his thoughts. Elias himself was a solitary figure, a gnarled stump in the vast white expanse. Today he was wrestling with a felled spruce, its branches bristling with snow. He wore layers of patched wool and deerskin so thoroughly integrated with the landscape he might have been another ancient tree. His beard, the color of winter rye, was streaked with hoarfrost, and his breath plumed in the frigid air. He moved with a quiet, persistent energy, not the frantic haste of a man battling the elements, but the methodical rhythm of someone in a long-term negotiation. Jeb noticed the peculiar way the dugout seemed to breathe, a wisp of smoke curling lazily from a squat, almost hidden chimney. Not a roaring plume, just a gentle exhalation. Jeb shook his head, a mix of grudging admiration and bewildered skepticism churning within him. The man was an enigma, a walking defiance of common sense. He'd heard the whispers in town, the snickers about Thorne's hay house and his peculiar methods. Jeb himself had initially scoffed, building into the earth, then piling on insulation that invited rodents and rot. It flew in the face of generations of Alaskan wisdom. Yet there was no denying the persistent quiet glow of Elias's presence out here year after year in a place that broke lesser men. Later that week, the scent of wood smoke and damp wool hung heavy in Marty Olson's general store. Old Man Hemlock, his face a road map of weathered wrinkles, was leaning against the counter, nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee. Jeb Miller was across from him, examining a coil of rope. The generator hummed a low thrum, barely audible over the clinking of jars as Marty restocked a shelf. "Heard you were out Hemlock Creek way, Jeb," Old Man Hemlock grunted, his voice raspy, like dry leaves skittering across ice. "See Thorne out there?" Jeb nodded slowly. "Saw him, wrestling a spruce, looked like." "Still at it, eh?" Hemlock scoffed, a thin smile creasing his lips. "Still building that contraption of his. Folks say he's got a whole menagerie living in there with him, what with all that hay." Marty Olson, a man whose patience was as thin as the ice on a spring puddle, interjected from behind the counter. "Now, Hemlock, you don't know that. Elias keeps to himself. Always has." "Keeps to himself because he's got secrets," Hemlock countered, tapping a gnarled finger on the counter. "Mark my words, that place ain't natural. Ain't right to live under the earth like a badger." Jeb stayed silent, his gaze fixed on a bag of flour. He respected Hemlock. The man had survived 5 decades in this unforgiving territory, knew every trick of the trade, every nuance of the wind. Hemlock's opinion carried weight, the weight of hard-won experience. And Hemlock, like most, clung to the tried and true, solid log walls, a roaring fire, and the constant battle against the encroaching cold. "Heard he ain't even got a proper stove," Hemlock continued, warming to his subject. "Just a little pot-belly, barely bigger than a hat. How's a man stay warm with that when it's 50 below?" Marty sighed, wiping down the counter with a damp rag. "Maybe he's found a way, Hemlock. The man's always been clever in his own way." "Clever?" Hemlock scoffed again. Foolish, more like. You watch. That place'll collapse on him one of these winters, or the rats'll carry him off, bit by bit. It ain't how we do things out here. Jeb listened, the familiar arguments echoing in his mind. The Alaskan winter was a relentless adversary, a thief of heat and a crusher of spirits. Most homesteaders lived in log cabins, stout affairs with thick walls, yet even those required a constant vigil. The wind found every crack, every chink in the mortar. Woodpiles had to be monumental, fires stoked round the clock. Nights were a symphony of creaks and groans as the timbers contracted, the cold pressing in, a palpable weight. Water buckets froze solid indoors if the fire dwindled too low. Frost rimed the window panes, a delicate lacework of ice that belied its brutal origin. He thought of his own cabin, a sturdy spruce structure he'd built with his father. Even with a roaring blaze in the jottle stove, the back wall, exposed to the prevailing northwest wind, always felt colder, a subtle chill that permeated the air. He'd woken more than once to find his breath fogging the air above his sleeping bag, despite the embers glowing in the hearth. The battle against the cold was an everyday reality, a constant drain on resources and energy. It was a shared experience, a common bond among the scattered community. And yet, Elias Thorne, the hermit of Hemlock Creek, seemed to exist outside of this shared struggle. He didn't visit town for monumental wood hauls. His smoke plume was thin, almost apologetic. His methods were unorthodox, even outlandish. And while Hemlock and the others scoffed, a tiny, insistent voice in Jeb's mind, a voice of quiet observation, began to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, Elias Thorne wasn't as foolish as everyone believed. The man had a fierce, independent light in his eyes, not the wildness of a lunatic, but the focused intensity of someone who saw things differently. And out here, sometimes, different was the only way to survive. The memory of the gentle curl of smoke from Thorne's dugout lingered, a curious warmth in the biting wind of skepticism, a mound of madness. The Alaskan sun, a pale, reluctant disk in the vast sky, offered little warmth as Elias Thorne began to carve his home from the earth. His tools were simple, a battered shovel, a pickaxe whose head was loose on its haft, and a determination that seemed to burn brighter than any fire. He'd chosen a slight rise, sheltered by a dense stand of spruce, where the ground sloped gently to the south. Day after day, the rhythmic thud-scrape-thud of his shovel echoed through the crisp air, a solitary drumbeat against the wilderness's silence. He dug deep, shaping a roughly rectangular pit, then began to excavate outward, creating an alcove for a stone hearth. Once the initial pit was sufficient, Elias set about gathering his building materials. He wasn't felling the tall, straight spruces like every other homesteader. Instead, he dragged fallen timber, often half-rotted, from the deeper woods, stripping it of its loose bark and shaping it with a broadaxe. These rough-hewn logs would form the skeletal framework of his roof. Then came the unconventional. He began to haul enormous bundles of dried grasses, collected from the marshy edges of the river, their golden strands gleaming against the dark earth. He stacked them meticulously, creating thick, insulating layers, binding them with salvaged twine and strips of rawhide. Over these he spread a thick layer of clay-rich mud, dug from a nearby streambed, smoothing it with his bare hands. Jebediah Miller, returning from his traplines, often skirted Thorne's strange construction. He'd dismount from his sled, ostensibly to check a snare on the periphery, but his gaze always drifted to the peculiar mound taking shape. "What in the devil is he building?" he muttered one afternoon to Silas, a young homesteader barely out of his teens who had stopped to warm his hands at Jeb's small fire. Silas, leaning on his own shovel, chuckled. "A hay house, Jeb. Heard him tell old man Hemlock it'll keep him warmer than any cabin." Jeb scoffed, a cloud of frosty breath escaping his lips. "Warmer? With hay and mud? That's a recipe for a frozen corpse, boy. The first hard freeze will turn that mud to brittle shale, and the hay will be a moldy mess. He'll be lucky if it doesn't collapse in on him." He shook his head, a mixture of pity and exasperation on his weathered face. "Fool's errand, I tell you. A man needs solid logs, a good foundation." Other homesteaders shared Jeb's sentiment. They would pass by, often pausing their own arduous tasks to cast curious, then dismissive, glances at Elias. "Looks like a badger's den or a grave waiting for the occupant. More proof of his madness. A man who shuns the tried and true in this land is a man already lost to the cold." Quote 5. He'll learn the hard way, like they all do. Alara Vance, however, watched with a different kind of intensity. She had come to the area barely a month ago, her young daughter bundled tightly against her chest, seeking refuge and a fresh start after a harsh winter had claimed her husband. Her own cabin, built quickly and somewhat shoddily, already felt inadequate against the encroaching chill. She understood the unspoken rules of the wilderness, the traditions that ensured survival. Yet Elias Thorne's unconventional dwelling, a growing mound of earth and plant matter, piqued a strange curiosity in her. She would stop at a discreet distance, pretending to gather firewood, her gaze fixed on Elias. She saw not madness, but an unwavering focus, a quiet defiance of common sense that was almost admirable. There was a method to his madness, she thought, a meticulousness that belied the crude materials. He wasn't just throwing things together, he was building. The way he layered the straw, the careful application of the mud, the strategic placement of the few salvaged timbers, it hinted at a deeper understanding, a knowledge she couldn't quite grasp. A tiny spark of hope, fragile as new ice, began to flicker within her. She dismissed it quickly. No one defied the Alaskan winter with a hay house. It was a foolish, dangerous gamble. Yet the image of Elias, a lone figure wrestling with the earth, continued to pull at her thoughts, a silent question against the certainty of the vast, indifferent land, echoes of the past. The scent of damp earth and drying grass was familiar now, a comforting balm compared to the sterile air he remembered. Elias paused, a rough-hewn beam balanced on his shoulder, his gaze momentarily lost in the shimmering heat rising from the distant mountains. The present blurred, replaced by a ghost from the past, the crisp, unforgiving architecture of the city skyline rising in his mind's eye. "Mr. Thorne, you expect us to finance this?" The voice, sharp and laced with derision, cut through the hum of the air conditioning. Elias stood before a panel of eminent architects and investors, the fluorescent lights glinting off the polished mahogany table. On the large screen behind him, a meticulously rendered 3D model of his proposed structure spun slowly. It was a marvel of biomimicry and radical thermal engineering, an undulating, subterranean dwelling, its exterior designed to be integrated with native flora, Its interior a labyrinth of passive ventilation and solar gain chambers. No exposed glass, no conventional roofline, just a gentle rise from the landscape. Gentlemen, this isn't just a building, it's an ecosystem, Elias had begun, his voice resonating with an earnest conviction that now felt impossibly naive. It achieves a net zero energy footprint by harnessing geothermal stability, solar capture through strategically placed light tubes, and natural convection currents. The structural integrity is derived from a composite of recycled aggregates and organic binders, forming an incredibly durable, insulative shell. A man with a perfectly sculpted silver beard, the chairman of the city's most influential development firm, leaned forward, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Thorne, are you suggesting we abandon centuries of architectural evolution for a glorified badger hole? Our clients desire panoramic views, open concept living, and the prestige of a visible edifice. Not to mention, the construction methods you propose are entirely unproven at scale." Elias had felt a prickle of heat rise in his neck. The methods are derived from ancient techniques, refined with modern material science, and prestige, sir, in an era of accelerating climate change, should be measured by ecological responsibility, not outward display. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the room. One woman, clad in a severe black suit, tapped a manicured nail on her tablet. "Your projections, Mr. Thorne, while theoretically fascinating, present significant upfront costs and logistical challenges. And frankly, the aesthetics, they lack appeal for the discerning urbanite. We build for tomorrow's leaders, not for hermits." The meeting had devolved quickly. His innovative designs, the culmination of years of relentless research and tireless iteration, were dismissed as impractical fantasies, the ramblings of a brilliant but ungrounded mind. The final blow came not from the panel, but from the architectural journals that picked up the story, branding his concept a subterranean folly and Elias himself as an eco-extremist. The professional doors slammed shut, one after another, until only the echoes of their derision remained. His name became synonymous with brilliant failure, a cautionary tale whispered in university design departments. The urban environment, once a vibrant canvas for his ambition, became a suffocating cage. Every gleaming skyscraper, every air-conditioned office block, seemed to mock his unheeded warnings. He saw the waste, the inefficiency, the short-sighted pursuit of aesthetics over sustainability, and it gnawed at him. He couldn't unsee it. The world he knew didn't want his solutions. Not yet. The decision to leave had been a slow, burning realization. He needed a blank slate, a place where the earth itself could be his laboratory, where the only critics were the elements, and the only proof needed was survival. Alaska, with its raw, untamed wilderness and its promise of self-sufficiency, had called to him like a siren song. Here, where the rules of conventional society held little sway, he could build, test, and live by his own radical principles. Here, he could prove them. He would prove them. The weight of the beam shifted, bringing Elias back to the present. The scent of pine and damp earth was real, grounding. The sun, a golden orb above the jagged peaks, was already beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep violet. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, a grim satisfaction settling in his chest. This hay house was more than just a dwelling. It was a defiant monument built on the ashes of a dream forged in the crucible of rejection. It was his second chance, the frost's first bite. Winter clamped its iron jaw on the Alaskan valley, a sudden, brutal assault that leached all warmth from the air. Log cabins, stout sentinels against the elements, groaned in protest. Inside, homesteaders shivered, their breath blooming like phantom flowers as they piled on layers of wool and fur. The ceaseless dance of wood stoves, a symphony of crackle and roar, became the valley's pulsing heart, each fed log a defiant whisper against the encroaching chill. Pillars of smoke rose from every chimney, stark banners in their ongoing war. Jebediah Miller, his hands gnarled and wise from years of labor, settled another birch log into his stove's fiery maw. The ensuing warmth, while a balm, felt thin, a flickering shield against the pervasive cold seeping through the chinked walls. He watched Sarah, his wife, draw closer to the hearth, her knitting needles a blur of motion, her gaze occasionally snagging on the frosted panes. This was their existence, a perpetual negotiation with an unforgiving land. Overnight, the world beyond their door had undergone a stark metamorphosis. What had been damp earth and skeletal branches was now a breathtaking expanse of white and crystalline ice. The air bit at the nostrils, sharp and clean, carrying the faint, distant tang of wood smoke and frozen pine. Jeb pushed open his cabin door, stepping onto the packed snow of his porch. Profound silence enveloped him, broken only by the mournful caw of a distant raven. He surveyed the valley, his wilderness-honed eyes taking in the familiar, snow-shrouded homesteads. Then something out of place snagged his attention. From the modest, hay-covered mound that was Elias Thorne's dugout, a faint wisp ascended into the frigid air. It wasn't smoke, too ethereal, too indistinct. It was more akin to a sigh, a gentle exhalation against the harsh landscape. Jeb squinted, shielding his eyes from the low-slung sun. The wisp shimmered, catching the light like spun silver, an ethereal plume against the backdrop of snow-dusted spruce. He dismissed it as an optical illusion, a trick of the bitter air distorting his vision. Yet the image clung to his mind. Later that afternoon, the sparse gathering at Marty's General Store revolved around a singular topic: the cold's relentless grip. Mittened hands cradled steaming mugs of coffee as men swapped tales of ice-encased water buckets and the insidious drafts that found every crack. "My water froze solid in the pitcher last night, right next to the stove," Silas complained, his breath still a visible cloud in the relative warmth of the store. "Had to chop more wood than a beaver building a dam," another grumbled. Jeb, nursing his own coffee, listened more than he spoke. His thoughts kept returning to the subtle wisp he'd witnessed at Elias's place. Finally, his voice low, he interjected, "Saw something peculiar this morning down by Thorne's place. Looked like steam, almost, coming right off his dugout." A ripple of skeptical chuckles moved through the small crowd. Old Man Hemlock, his face a topographical map of wrinkles etched by decades of Alaskan winters, snorted. "Steam? From that dirt hole? The cold's finally gotten to your eyes, Jebediah. Or maybe young Thorne's finally gone round the bend, boiling water just to see it fog up the valley." He tapped his temple with a gnarled finger. "That kind of building, it's not natural. Goes against everything we know about keeping warm out here." "Heard he lined the whole thing with hay," someone else offered, shaking his head. "Hay for insulation. What's he think? He's a rabbit?" Jeb felt a flicker of annoyance, but bit his tongue. He respected Hemlock's hard-won wisdom, but he also trusted his own eyes. The wisp had been subtle, yes, but undeniably present. It hadn't resembled a conventional chimney plume. Elias hadn't even built a proper chimney. It wasn't smoke, Jeb insisted quietly, his gaze locking with Hemlock's. It was different, like warmth escaping. Hemlock merely scoffed, nudging his spectacles higher. Warmth escaping from a hole in the ground? Boy, you're either seeing things, or Elias Thorne's found a way to conjure spirits. More likely, it's the cold playing tricks on your eyes. Happens when the air gets this sharp, makes everything shimmer. Don't go imagining things, Jeb. Stick to what's real. Stick to log walls and good, dry birch. That's what keeps a man alive out here, not some fancy dirt pile and a head full of wild ideas. The conversation promptly veered back to more conventional woes, the fluctuating price of kerosene and the accumulating snow on the north slopes. But Jeb couldn't dislodge the image. He understood the cold, knew its deceptions, but this felt distinct. It pecked at the edges of his practical mind, a tiny seed of curiosity nestled in the frozen soil of his skepticism. He wondered briefly what it felt like inside Elias Thorne's peculiar dwelling, sheltered by earth and hay against winter's first relentless bite. The great white silence. The sky, a bruised purple just moments before, ripped open. It wasn't a gradual descent into winter's fury. It was a sudden, violent lashing. Wind, a living entity, shrieked through the pines, tearing at their skeletal branches. Snow, fine as dust, then coarse as sand, then weighty as wet wool, began to fall. It didn't drift. It piled, slammed, and swirled in a relentless, blinding whiteout. Elara Vance, wrestling a reluctant axe from a frozen log, felt the shift in the air like a physical blow. Her breath caught, her lungs burning with the sudden Arctic draft. She glanced towards her cabin, a plume of smoke from its chimney already thinning, dissipating into the maelstrom. Lily, her daughter, was inside, bundled by the hearth, drawing pictures on a slate. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Elara's resolve. Her late husband, a man whose hands had known the bite of a dozen Alaskan winters, had always said to respect the mountain. This wasn't respect. This was surrender. By nightfall, the blizzard had transformed the familiar landscape into an alien, undulating expanse of white. Visibility was zero, the world reduced to the immediate terrifying confines of their cabin. The wind howled down the chimney, spitting embers onto the hearth. Elara and her husband, Silas, worked in strained silence, piling every spare blanket, every fur throw, onto Lily's small bed. Their daughter, usually a whirlwind of energy, lay pale and still, her breath coming in shallow, wheezing gasps. "She's burning up, Silas," Elara whispered, her voice rough with worry, pressing her palm to Lily's flushed forehead. "The fever! It's worse!" Silas, his face etched with exhaustion, stoked the fire. The logs, though burning fiercely, seemed to offer little resistance to the cold that seeped through the chinks in the walls, a pervasive, insidious chill that clung to their bones. He'd plugged every visible crack with moss and mud, but the cabin, for all its sturdy log construction, was losing the battle. The thermometer, nailed to the wall, usually a reliable gauge, now read a chilling 30 degrees Fahrenheit inside. Outside, it was anyone's guess, but the unrelenting wind suggested something far more brutal. Lily coughed, a wet, rattling sound that tore at Elara's heart. Her small body trembled under the weight of the blankets. "Mama, cold?" She whimpered, her eyes fluttering open, wide and glazed. "No, sweetheart, you're warm," Alara lied, pulling the blankets tighter, feeling the frantic heat radiating from her daughter. It was a fever heat, not warmth from the fire. This was pneumonia, she knew, having seen its cruel work before, and without the medicine Elias had brought in the fall, they were helpless. Across the valley, Jebediah Miller hunkered down in his own robust cabin, the thick logs groaning under the assault of the wind. He'd spent the afternoon securing everything, tying down his sled, reinforcing his lean-to, bringing in enough firewood for a week, maybe more. His dogs, usually restless, were curled tight by the stove, their breath fogging the air. He checked his own thermometer, 35 degrees. Better than most, he thought, but still a long way from comfortable. He thought of Alara and Silas, their cabin a little less substantial than his, a little more exposed. And the little one, Lily. He'd seen her playing by the creek just a few days ago, a bright spark in the growing gloom. He hoped they were well. The blizzard raged for 3 days, then 4. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by the great white silence that only a true Alaskan storm could create. The wind still screamed, but the snow had piled so high against the cabins that it muffled the sound, creating an eerie, suffocating quiet within. The community was cut off, each family isolated in their frozen cocoons. Despair, a slow, creeping chill, began to set in. Alara's husband, Silas, had gone out on the 3rd day, desperate for more firewood, only to be turned back by a snowdrift taller than himself, the wind so fierce it stole the air from his lungs. He'd returned, defeated, his face a mask of frost and terror. Their wood supply was dwindling fast. They were rationing their dried meat and berries, but the cold was the real enemy. Lily's condition worsened with each passing hour. Her cough became more frequent, her breathing more labored. Her little hands and feet, despite being swaddled in wool, felt perpetually cold. Alara held her daughter close, trying to share her own body heat, but she too felt the encroaching numbness. She looked at Silas, his eyes hollow with fear, and saw her own reflection of helplessness. The logs of their cabin, once a symbol of their resilience, now felt like the walls of a tomb, slowly freezing them alive. In the brief lulls between the gale-force blasts, Alara sometimes imagined she could hear things, the faint, distant moan of the wind, or perhaps the creak of a distant tree. Or was it, she wondered in a moment of desperate fantasy, a whisper of something else, something warmer, something defying the impossible cold? She dismissed it as delirium, brought on by exhaustion and worry. No one could truly defy this, not even Elias Thorne and his mad hay house. An unlikely offer. The wind howled a banshee's lament, rattling the Vance cabin's single window pane. Inside, the fire was a dim, defiant spark against the encroaching cold. Alara pressed her hand against Lily's forehead, the heat alarming, a stark contrast to the icy air permeating the small dwelling. Silas was outside, wrestling with a frozen woodpile, his grunts of frustration carrying faintly through the walls. Despair, a bitter taste, coated Alara's tongue. Suddenly, a series of sharp, urgent knocks hammered at the door, startling Alara so violently she dropped the wet cloth she was using to cool Lily's brow. Who could possibly be out in this maelstrom? Silas, she knew, would never knock. He'd simply push through, a flurry of snow and effort. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. Silas burst in moments later, a white apparition caked in snow, his eyes wide. "Elias!" he gasped, the name barely audible above the gale. He's he's here!" Elara felt a jolt of disbelief. Elias Thorne? The hermit, the one who lived in that ridiculous buried house miles away. He hadn't been seen since he delivered a small vial of antibiotic for Lily's cough in the early fall, a rare act of neighborly grace she'd almost forgotten. The door creaked open again, admitting a blast of frigid air and a figure silhouetted against the swirling white. Elias Thorne stood there, a gaunt shadow, his face etched with the bite of the wind, but his eyes held an uncharacteristic urgency. He was bundled in layers of worn wool and fur, a thick, frost-rimmed beard obscuring much of his face. He didn't step inside fully, seemingly hesitant to intrude, or perhaps aware of the chill he carried. "Lily!" he rasped, his voice raw from the cold. "I heard—" He paused, scanning the small, desperate room, his gaze resting briefly on Lily's flushed face. "She needs warmth. Our place. It's holding a steady 60. You should bring her there." Elara stared, dumbfounded. The sheer audacity of the offer, the impossible journey, the man himself. Silas, recovering from his initial shock, moved to block the doorway slightly, a protective instinct overriding his exhaustion. "Our place?" Silas echoed, a wary skepticism hardening his tone. "You mean that hole in the ground?" Elias didn't flinch. "It's sheltered, insulated. You saw the hay. It's working." His gaze was steady, unwavering, holding a strange mix of desperation and conviction. "It's the only chance she has, Silas. This blizzard, it's going to get worse before it gets better. This cabin won't hold out much longer against the cold." Alara's mind reeled. Lily's shallow breaths, the faint rattle in her chest, the blue tinge to her lips. These were stark realities. The thought of moving her, exposing her to the lethal cold outside, was terrifying. But the alternative, staying here, watching her fade, was unbearable. A new voice, raspy and imbued with a lifetime of suspicion, cut through the tense silence. Old Man Hemlock, who had ridden out the first brunt of the storm at their cabin, slowly emerged from the shadows near the hearth, his gnarled hand gripping his walking stick like a weapon. He glowered at Elias. "Don't you listen to him, Elara," Hemlock croaked, his voice thick with age and distrust. "That man ain't right, living like a badger in the dirt. No good can come of it. That place is probably full of damp and mold. A death trap, I tell you." He spat on the floor, a sound swallowed by the wind. "He's always been strange, that one. Buildin' his house out of weeds and mud. Probably got some devilry in there." Hemlock's words, though harsh, resonated with the deep-seated prejudice the community held against Elias and his unconventional dwelling. Elara felt a fresh wave of fear, mingled with the potent cocktail of desperation and exhaustion. Yet, even as Hemlock spoke, she felt Lily's small hand twitch in hers, the heat radiating from it a silent, urgent plea. Silas looked from Elias to Hemlock, then to Elara, his face a mask of indecision. He knew Hemlock's warnings were born of ingrained suspicion, but the old man's words still planted seeds of doubt. "The journey? It's impossible, Elias," Silas finally managed, the words heavy with defeat. "Even if we trusted your warmth, we'd freeze before we got halfway." Elias stepped fully into the cabin then, closing the door against the shrieking wind, though a fine powder of snow still dusted his shoulders. His eyes, usually distant, now held a fierce, unblinking intensity. I wouldn't be offering if I hadn't planned for it. I have a sled, wrapped in canvas and blankets. We'd move fast. It's a risk, yes, but staying here, that's a certainty, Alara, a certainty of cold and worse. His words, blunt and unvarnished, struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. A certainty of worse. She looked down at Lily, her small chest heaving, her feverish breath misting faintly in the frigid air. The fire was dying. The last of their good wood burned to ash. Hope, a fragile, barely flickering ember, ignited within her. It was an insane, terrifying proposition, born of madness and desperation. But what choice did she truly have? Into the belly of the beast, the wind howled a mournful dirge, a wall of white fury that threatened to swallow them whole. Silas, his face etched with a desperate resolve, wrapped Lily tighter in the thick wool blanket, her small body trembling against his chest. Alara, leaning into the gale, held a dim lantern aloft, its feeble glow carving a tiny, dancing sphere of visibility in the maelstrom. Every step was a battle, a plunge into drifts that reached their knees, the snow, biting, at exposed skin with icy teeth. Elias, a shadowy figure ahead, moved with an almost unnatural ease, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the churning powder. Behind them, a scattering of figures watched from the meager shelter of their cabin porches, their faces grim and shadowed by the blizzard's cruelty. Jebediah Miller stood among them, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He shook his head slowly, a silent testament to the folly he perceived. "He's leading them to their doom," he muttered, his voice rough with concern, though he knew the Vances had little choice. The fever claimed too many in these winters. Alara's own breath hitched in her throat with each labored step. Lily's shivering was less a tremor now, and more a violent spasm, her small lungs struggling against the icy air. "Elias, how much further?" she rasped, her voice stolen by the wind. He paused, turning his head slightly, his features obscured by the flying snow. "Almost there, Alara. Just keep pushing." His voice, usually gruff and withdrawn, held an unusual urgency, a thread of something akin to compassion that Alara had never heard from him before. It was that unexpected note of sincerity, more than any logic, that fueled her weary legs. The alternative, watching Lily fade in their own frozen cabin, was unthinkable. The journey felt endless, an eternity measured in agonizingly slow, snow-choked strides. The lantern's beam eventually caught a faint outline against the swirling white, a low mound, barely distinguishable from the snowdrifts around it, save for a sturdy, half-buried wooden door. It was less a dwelling and more a scar on the landscape, an earthen burrow. Dread mingled with a sliver of desperate hope in Alara's chest. Elias unlatched the heavy door, the sound of protesting wood swallowed by the wind. A blast of unexpectedly warm air rushed past them, carrying a faint scent of dry earth and something herbal. It was a shocking sensation, like stepping into another season. Silas, still clutching Lily, stumbled across the threshold first, his eyes wide with disbelief. Alara followed, pulling the door shut behind her, plunging the interior into near darkness before Elias lit a small, oil-fueled lamp. The warmth was immediate, enveloping them like a thick, comforting blanket. It wasn't the biting, dry heat of a wood stove in an ill-insulated cabin. It was a pervasive, gentle warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The air was surprisingly fresh, not stale or stuffy. Alara's stiff fingers, numb with cold, tingled as blood rushed back into them. She looked around, her gaze sweeping over the curved earthen walls, the rough-hewn beams supporting a ceiling of packed earth, a small, enclosed firebox in one corner. There were no visible drafts, no icy tendrils creeping from cracks. Silas knelt, carefully unwrapping Lily. Her small face was still flushed, but the violent shivers that had racked her body had begun to subside. A soft sigh escaped her lips as the warmth seeped into her bones. Her eyelids fluttered, and she turned her head slightly, her gaze unfocused but less distressed. She's not shaking as much," Elara whispered, her voice thick with emotion, a fragile tendril of hope unfurling in her chest. She reached out, touching Lily's forehead. It was still hot, but the cold, clammy feel of her skin was gone, replaced by a dry heat. Elias, his face softened by the lamplight, gestured towards a small, built-in bed nook, lined with furs. "Lay her there. I have some elderberry tea. It's warm." His concern was palpable, a stark contrast to the distant, unapproachable man they knew. As Silas gently placed Lily on the furs, a faint, almost imperceptible murmur of comfort escaped her. Her tiny hand, no longer clenched in a desperate fist, relaxed against the soft pelt. Elara watched, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time in hours, the suffocating grip of fear began to loosen, replaced by a tentative, blossoming belief that perhaps, just perhaps, they had made the right choice. They were in the belly of the beast, but it was a beast that offered a refuge they had never imagined. The engineer's revelation. The burrow's interior was a revelation, not just in its warmth, but in the quiet hum of its sustained climate. Elias, his earlier urgency now replaced by a calm, almost academic demeanor, gestured around the single, spacious room. "It's not magic, Elara," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle. "It's principles, thermal mass, primarily." He pointed to the thick, packed earth walls, smooth and almost luminous in the soft glow of a battery lantern. The earth itself acts as a massive battery, absorbing and releasing heat slowly. During the day, what little sun pierces the snow, or even the ambient geothermal warmth, gets stored. Elara, cradling Lily closer, felt the tremors in her daughter's small body gradually recede. The 58-degree difference between the outside and inside wasn't just a number, it was a tangible, life-saving cocoon. "And the hay?" she whispered, her voice still hoarse from the cold and fear. Elias nodded, a faint flicker of pride in his eyes. "Insulation. Straw bales are incredible insulators. They trap air, preventing heat from escaping and cold from entering. It's like a giant, woven blanket. Then there's the passive solar gain. The south-facing window, even when obscured by snow, still allows some radiant heat to transfer, contributing to the internal temperature." He walked over to a small, almost invisible vent near the ceiling. "And controlled ventilation. It's a closed system, but fresh air is carefully managed, drawn in and warmed before it circulates." Elara looked from Elias to Lily, whose breathing was now shallow and even. The architect spoke with a quiet conviction, his earlier gruffness replaced by the passion of an engineer explaining his masterpiece. It was a stark contrast to the blizzard's chaotic fury just beyond the insulated walls. She couldn't fully grasp the scientific intricacies, but the undeniable comfort surrounding them was proof enough. Hope, fragile but persistent, began to unfurl within her. Meanwhile, back in the village, the blizzard raged, but not without its curious observers. Jebediah Miller, after securing his own cabin as best he could, found himself plagued by the image of Elias Thorne leading the Vances into the white abyss. The hermit's strange structure, dismissed for so long as folly, now loomed large in Jeb's mind. He was a man who trusted what he could see and measure. When the storm finally abated enough for cautious movement, and news began to filter through the handful of still-functioning radios about Lily Vance's miraculous recovery in Thorne's dugout, Jeb grabbed his most trusted thermometer. He bundled up, the cold still biting, and trudged through the drifts to his own well-built log cabin. Inside, the fire had been going strong, yet the air was brisk. The thermometer, placed carefully on his rough-hewn table, settled at a chill 12 degrees above zero. He scribbled the number on a scrap of paper, his brow furrowed. Later that afternoon, driven by an unshakable curiosity and the growing whispers of the Vance's astounding tale, Jebediah ventured towards Elias's hidden dwelling. The entrance, almost indistinguishable from a snowdrift, was a testament to its design. Cautiously, he pushed aside the heavy insulated door and stepped inside. The immediate rush of warmth was disorienting, like walking into a different season. He found Elias tending to a now resting Lily, a faint smile on his usually stern face. Without a word, Jeb placed his thermometer on a small, exposed shelf. The mercury climbed steadily, almost defying belief. It hovered, then settled. 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference was not merely significant, it was revolutionary. 62 degrees colder outside, yet inside, a comfortable, life-sustaining warmth. Jeb stared at the reading, then at Elias, a new respect dawning in his eyes. Word, like a spark on dry tinder, traveled fast, carried by the few who dared brave the lingering cold. 58 degrees warmer! Jeb's voice, usually steady, held a tremor of disbelief as he recounted his findings over the crackling radio. The news sliced through the community, creating immediate division. Old Man Hemlock, a patriarch of the old ways, scoffed, his voice raspy with indignation over the radio's static. "Hogwash! Witchcraft, more like, or a trick with those fancy gadgets. No hay pile can keep a body warm like that. It's a devil's bargain, I tell you." His dismissal, steeped in superstition and distrust of anything new, resonated with some. Thorne had always been an outsider, his methods unorthodox. For others, however, especially those whose woodpiles were dwindling and cabins still frigid, Jebediah's empirical evidence was a beacon. The community, already strained by the relentless winter, now found itself split, not just by the blizzard, but by the engineer's revelation. A community transformed. The blizzard raged for another day, but inside Elias's burrow, a different kind of storm had passed. Lily, no longer pale and shivering, chased a dust mote dancing in a beam of sunlight that pierced the small, carefully angled skylight. Her laughter, light as the flakes still swirling outside, echoed softly against the packed earth walls. Elara watched her, a knot of fear slowly unraveling from her chest, replaced by a profound, almost disorienting gratitude. Lily, animated and vibrant, was living proof of the burrow's impossible warmth, a testament to Elias's quiet conviction. She was a beacon of hope in the heart of a winter that had threatened to extinguish them all. The following morning, the wind's howl was replaced by a strained quiet. The snow had eased, but the cold remained a predatory beast, its teeth sharp and visible in the frosted air. Elias, emerging from the burrow to clear the entrance, found a figure hunched against the frigid wind, snow-covered and gaunt. It was Maeve, a young mother from the settlement, her face etched with a desperation that mirrored Alara's own just days before. Her breath plumed in frantic gasps as she explained, her voice raw, that her infant, Thomas, was fading, succumbing to the relentless chill of their cabin. Elias simply nodded, his eyes devoid of judgment, only a deep, quiet understanding. He gestured towards the burrow's entrance. Maeve hesitated, her gaze flickering from the unimposing mound of earth to Elias's weathered face, then to the faint warmth emanating from the opening. The stories of the hay house had been rampant, scoffed at by many, but the sight of Lily, rosy-cheeked and bundled, peering out from the entrance with a curious grin, shattered Maeve's remaining skepticism. With a whispered prayer, she stepped inside, clutching her bundled infant. Over the next few hours, the burrow, designed for a solitary existence, began to swell. Jebediah, his face a mask of grim determination, arrived with his own family. His wife, Sarah, bundled their two youngest children, their small faces blue with cold. Jebediah himself carried their eldest, a boy named Finn, whose cough was a rasping sound that tore at Alara's heart. Jebediah's initial reluctance was palpable, his eyes still holding a flicker of the community's distrust. But the biting reality of their collapsing cabin, its walls offering little protection against the creeping cold, had overridden his pride. He simply nodded curtly to Elias, his gaze sweeping over the growing group of refugees, a silent acknowledgment of the burrow's undeniable necessity. Soon the small space was a microcosm of the struggling settlement. The air, once still and quiet, now hummed with the soft murmurs of worried parents, the occasional whimper of an infant, and the low, reassuring tones of Elias moving among them. Blankets, retrieved from Elias's surprisingly well-stocked shelves, were shared. Hot water, heated over a small, efficient stove Elias had designed, was a precious commodity, used for soothing teas and warming compresses. Initial awkwardness hung heavy, a palpable tension amongst people who had long viewed Elias as an eccentric outsider, and each other with the usual village rivalries. Maeve kept her infant close, her eyes darting nervously. Jebediah sat stiffly, his back to the wall, his gaze fixed on his ailing son. But as the hours stretched and the burrow held firm against the brutal cold outside, a subtle shift began. Shared fear gave way to shared stories. Sarah, quietly tending to Finn, recounted how their cabin's roof had almost caved under the snow's weight. Maeve, cradling a now sleeping Thomas, spoke of the desperation that had driven her through the drifts. Elias, for his part, moved with a quiet efficiency, distributing rations, ensuring everyone had a place to rest, even if it meant sleeping shoulder to shoulder. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant, calming anchor. He offered no "I told you so's," no lectures on sustainable design. He simply offered sanctuary, and in doing so, offered something far more profound. Lily, oblivious to the adults' shifting dynamics, found a new game, counting the different colored threads in Elias's rough-spun blanket, occasionally glancing up at the faces around her, their features softened by the burrow's gentle light. Her innocent curiosity chipped away at the remaining walls of suspicion. She was a child, and in her recovery, she was a testament not to an abstract theory, but to life itself. By the second night, the burrow was a living, breathing entity. The rhythmic breathing of sleeping children, the soft crackle of the stove, the hushed conversations. It was a symphony of survival. Jebediah, his face less rigid, found himself sharing a story about a particularly harsh winter from his own childhood, a rare moment of vulnerability. Ilara, sitting beside him, offered a shared smile. The prejudice, the suspicion, the long-held beliefs about Elias and his strange ways were slowly being eroded, not by argument, but by the tangible, life-saving warmth of the earth around them. They were no longer just disparate families, but a temporary, interdependent community bound by the unforgiving winter and the unlikely refuge of a burrow built by a man they had all, in their own ways, dismissed. The thaw and the future, the blizzard which had raged with the fury of a wounded beast, finally began to recede. A gradual hush fell over the land, replacing the ceaseless shriek of wind and the battering of ice. Inside Elias's burrow, the shift was subtle at first. The distant howl softened to a moan, then a whisper, until only the faint rhythmic drip of melting snow from the outer layers of the earth shelter punctuated the profound silence. When Elias finally unbarred the heavy door, a wave of cool, fresh air, devoid of the biting wind, washed over them. The light, though diffused by thick cloud cover, felt blinding after days of lantern glow. Outside, the world was utterly transformed. Snow lay in monumental drifts, sculpting the familiar landscape into an alien terrain of soft, undulating curves. But crucially, the air was still. A tentative sunbeam pierced the clouds, striking a nearby spruce, and a cascade of glittering snow crystals detached and drifted lazily to the ground. The very air tasted of melting ice and damp earth, a promise of something new. From the mouth of the burrow, Alara stepped out, shielding her eyes. Lily, bundled in a borrowed wool coat, peered out from behind her mother's leg, her gaze wide with wonder at the pristine, untouched expanse. "It's like a giant blanket," she whispered, her voice still a little hoarse, but imbued with a child's boundless curiosity. Soon the other families emerged, blinking against the muted light. Jebediah, his face etched with exhaustion, but his eyes clear, stood beside Maeve, who held a sleeping Thomas close. Finn, though still pale, was awake and leaning against his father's leg, watching a raven circle overhead. The shared ordeal had forged an unspoken bond between them all. The initial awkwardness had given way to a quiet camaraderie born of mutual reliance and the profound relief of survival. Over the next few days, as the snow continued its slow, magnificent thaw, the community began to stir. Reports trickled in, a collapsed roof here, a frozen water pipe there, but remarkably, no further loss of life. The burrow's inhabitants, having weathered the storm in an improbable oasis of warmth, emerged with a unique perspective. They had seen firsthand what was possible. It began subtly. Jebediah, always pragmatic, was the first to approach Elias. He found Elias outside, meticulously clearing a path through a snowdrift, his movements precise and unhurried. "Elias," Jeb began, his voice rough but respectful, that place of yours, it saved us all." He paused, searching for the right words. "My cabin. It's not bad, not by the standards we've got, but it was a struggle. Keeping the fire going, the drafts, it was endless." He gestured vaguely towards the distant cluster of cabins. "There's got to be a better way. I've been thinking about the way your walls held the heat." Elias stopped his shoveling, leaning on the handle. He met Jebediah's gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his own eyes. "Straw bales," he said simply. "Earth berms." Jeb nodded slowly. I saw it, the thickness of it. You were right, Elias. We all thought you were a fool." He offered a small, contrite smile. "I'm not ashamed to admit I was wrong. I'd be grateful for any advice you could offer on strengthening my own place." Soon others followed. Young men, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, came to observe Elias's structure, tracing the thick, rounded walls, noting the placement of the small, well-insulated windows. Women, their faces softer now, brought Elias small gifts of baked bread and dried berries, offerings of gratitude and a quiet plea for knowledge. They spoke of drafty corners, of endless chopping, of the fear that had gripped them during the blizzard. They spoke not with resentment, but with a newfound humility. Elias, who had once been a figure of ridicule, an eccentric hermit, found himself at the center of a quiet revolution. He wasn't loud or charismatic. He merely answered their questions with patient, practical explanations. He showed them how to stack bales, how to mix clay and straw for plaster, how to angle a window to maximize passive solar gain. He didn't preach, he demonstrated. He sketched designs in the thawing earth with a stick, explaining principles of thermal mass and air circulation that had once seemed outlandish. He watched them, these people who had once scoffed at his hay house. He saw the earnest curiosity in their eyes, the dawning comprehension. He saw the way their hands, hardened by years of labor, now eagerly picked up fragments of straw, testing its resilience. He saw the children, Lily among them, playing near his burrow, no longer afraid, but enchanted by its organic form. He saw the future, not just for his isolated dwelling, but for the entire community. A quiet satisfaction bloomed within him. It wasn't triumph, not in the way of vanquishing an opponent. It was deeper, more profound. It was the satisfaction of purpose fulfilled, of knowledge shared, of an idea taking root in fertile ground. The thaw had not only melted the snow, it had begun to melt the prejudice, the skepticism, and the rigid adherence to old ways. As Elias looked out over the thawing wilderness, at the distant cabins where new ideas were already taking shape, he knew his place was no longer on the fringes. He was here, part of this reborn community, shaping its future. One bale of straw, one earth berm, one shared understanding at a time. The winter had been harsh, but its end brought not just spring, but a profound, lasting change.